I know more people are gonna keep showing up as the minutes continue, but since we have to stop at 7, I think I'm gonna start with the welcome. Welcome everyone. I am Luis Otoniel Rosa. I'm an associate professor of Spanish and ethnic studies here at UNL. Welcome to our second event of the semester this year's Humanities on the Edge speaker series. Humanities on the Edge, now in its 12th year, has brought to Nebraska almost 50 scholars from all around the world with a great variety of perspectives, intellectual traditions, and diverse positionalities, all united in the spirit of urgency of these times, always at the edge of our world views, pushing us to have difficult conversations as we theorize our human and planetary realities. We're so grateful to the many sponsors who support this series, the Departments of English, Communication Studies, Philosophy, Modern Languages and Literatures, and the Institute of Ethnic Studies, as well as UNL's Faculty Senate, the Research Council, and the Sheldon Museum. The founders of the series are Professors Marco Abel and Roland Beccio from the English department, who also edit the book series Provocations, that is very much tied to Humanities on the Edge at the University of Nebraska Press. A couple of years later, after the foundation, Professor Janet Aileen Jones from History joined the team, and only in the last couple of years, Erin Hannas from the Sheldon Museum and myself, Luis Otoniel Rosa, joined the team. Every year, Humanities on the Edge focuses on a different theme, and because of COVID, the theme of this year has been extended over 2 years. A world of migrants, displacement, decoloniality, necrocapitalism. As the rich countries of the world have initiated an era of ecological catastrophe, including oil wars across continents, legions of migrants from the global south are seeking refuge in the countries on the north that are largely responsible for their dispossession. We thought at Humanities on the Edge that it was the right moment to devote an entire year of events focusing on the need to create a new theoretical framework that prepare us to understand and act in the world to come, the world that is already here, a world of migrants. Our last 3 speakers have focused mostly on the US-Mexico border from many different disciplines. We had the philosopher from Tijuana, Mexico, Sayak Valencia, the novelist from Tamaulipas, Mexico, Cristina Rivera Garza, and the art critic from Tijuana, Mexico, Sergio Delgado. All of these videos you can find on YouTube, on our YouTube page. I invite you to check them out. Today, we're inviting a Puerto Rican and Caribbean scholar, a trained sociologist and a colonial thinker, to offer us yet another perspective on this topic of a world of migrants. Next semester, we will bring the philosopher of migration, Thomas Nail, and the art historian, Ana Arabindan Quezon, to close out the series, hopefully this time at the Sheldon Museum presentially. It is then a tremendous honor and a privilege for me to introduce Dr. Ramón Grosfoguel, fellow Puerto Rican, professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley, and one of the most influential and prolific scholars of the colonial theory all over Latin America, Spain, and the US, and he's an intercontinental philosopher. A courageous scholar whose writings and lectures all over the world, which are easily accessed on YouTube, where sometimes it appears that Ramon has clones giving talks in different countries at the same time. And most of his publications can also be found on the web because are open access. He has dedicated his life to the project of the decolonial turn, a project that over the decades has helped us see the intrinsic relation between imperialism, capitalism, and white supremacy, concepts that we often study as if they were separate modern phenomenons. His project also challenged our leftist and liberal paradigms and often made many people in academia uncomfortable because the decolonial turn meant that professors and students needed to unlearn their curriculums, because that which we thought was universal knowledge turned out to be the knowledge of just a tiny fraction of the human experience imposed over the world by the westernized university. But learning requires that uncomfortability, and the project of the decolonial turn that was often dismissed in the past decades for either being too radical or just for requiring too much work, laziness is sometimes an enemy, today is renewed by a new generation of Latin American scholars and activists that, inspired in Grosfoguel's work, are decolonizing their own institutions around our continent. Decoloniality has become one of the central debates across our universities. Many of the most polemic positions of Ramón has over the years have aged incredibly well, like his very early critique of the liberal intellectuals who supported the Iraq war in the name of Western values, or like his book on Latinos in the world system that I really recommend, that already in 2005 warn us of the intensification of white supremacy that actually happens in the next 15 years. Or his lifelong critique from a Department of Ethnic Studies, a historical one in Berkeley, of liberal multiculturalism and identity politics, his critique of that as a way to talk about diversity without having to talk about racial and social justice, or more closer to me, a more personal position, his proposition 20 years ago of a radical statehood for Puerto Rico, where the old left had become dogmatically independentist. He was the first person who I heard saying this when I was 16 years old, and a very active independentist, and it blew my mind that I hadn't even considered the statehood for Puerto Rico could be a tactical anti-imperialist move to connect our struggle to the struggles of Black and brown peoples in the US. And now the major leftist party in the island, in Puerto Rico, is a new one that also includes pro-statehood peoples. And I still believe in the independence of Puerto Rico, but it was you, Ramón, who made me question the racist, sexist, Hispanicist, conservative, and even narcissistic elements of my own Puerto Rican independentist tradition. And to this day, I follow your writings and lectures to keep pushing my intellectual education. This morning, graduate students from English, sociology, Spanish, and ethnic studies here at UNL read many of Grosfoguel's most important articles and discussed them with him in a very productive and generative morning session with coffee. I will add that list of articles to the chat, and I will keep adding things to the chat as the talk progresses. All of them are very easy to find on the internet. Ramon's talk today is titled Modernity, Racism, and Migration, a journey from the zone of non-being to the zone of being. And we hope to have at least 20 minutes for questions at the end. So as soon as you think of your questions, you can post them directly in the Q&A feature, not in the chat, in the Q&A feature, so we can see them. Ramón, it is a pleasure and an honor to have you working with us today. The floor is yours, compañero.
Thank you very much, Luis, for that introduction. Thank you for all the good words. And thank you also for the invitation to the University of Nebraska to be here sharing with all of you. The question of migration, I've written a lot about that, but I would like to focus in terms of trying to bring, like, because this colloquium is focused on paradigm shift, I would like to bring a few ideas to frame international migration. What happened with many of the literature on international migration is that they're basically focused on a very narrow way of looking at it, which is basically looking at the, migrants, where are they coming from? And then once they get to the USA, how they're incorporated into the USA, which niche in the labor market. I mean, and things like this, that usually miss many aspects, and for years, we have the paradigm of assimilation, saying that all migrants arrive to the USA after 2-3 generations, they will, experience upward social mobility. And, and after getting assimilated to the mainstream culture of the USA, it was called, called the melting pot theory. we all get into a melting pot, etc. Well, all that theory got in a, basically a big crisis over time, because first, the reality of the fact is that people do not assimilate in the way it was portrayed by that theory. And second, even people who assimilate, there were many people who, many groups of people who, even though they assimilate to American culture, they still live exclusion. They still live, they don't live upward social mobility in the US after 3-4 generations. So there were many anomalies in the theory that the theory couldn't explain. Then you have the cultural pluralist theory saying that, well, after all, migrants do not get rid of their identities, they just develop hyphenated identities. People become Irish, people become Irish American, Jewish people become Jewish American, and so on, and then it was a matter that the cultural pluralist theory basically also have an anomaly, which is they couldn't explain the experience, of exclusion of groups that in the USA has been racially inferiorized. Okay, and then you have a structural, more historical structural perspective, looking at migration in more global perspective, which I identify more with that kind of perspective, although I will bring in other aspects to it, and also the transnationalism as a theory in international migration have been very fruitful and an excellent theory, but at the same time, I have made over the years some critical comments to it, despite the fact that I consider both the transnationalist perspective and the historical structural perspective, more war system perspective, as very useful and as a positive step forward from the previous theories. And so, having said that, I would like to go over certain concepts that I think are fundamental for us to understand international migration. In my using decolonial theory, I developed my own theory of international migration. What I did was to basically take some of the insights of the world system theory and transnationalist perspective in international migration, and then bring some aspects that I think are fundamental. For example, one thing I try to understand is we need to get away from the notion of migrants as some kind of homogeneous category, okay? Migrants usually are conceived in many of these literature like lumping together a lot of experiences that are not the same. They are not the same. And so the question of modes of incorporation into the USA, in this case, or into Western Europe, is related with an issue that have to do with how are the migrants that arrive perceived by the hegemonic or host population, okay? And usually what happens is that you have some people that arrive to, for example, USA, and immediately they are, the migrants do not arrive to a tabula rasa space, to an empty space. They arrive to a place that is already polluted with histories, racial classification, racial hierarchies, you name it, and a history of that. And so what happened with many migrants is that when they arrive, they are immediately classified in some way or another according to the space they arrive, okay? They don't arrive to an empty space. They arrive to a space polluted already with histories and racial classification, racial hierarchies, class struggles, etc. So they arrive to places where they are already a structure. So when you arrive to a place as a migrant, you arrive to a place that is already constituted in many ways in terms of multiple hierarchies of power, you know. So, so when people arrive, I make a distinction between those who get perceived by the host population as part of the white European experience, and therefore they are classified as another white migrant or white people, and immediately they get an experience in the USA that is, you know, by being classified as whites, that is quite different from populations that when they arrive to the USA, they get classified as blacks or Latinos, or, you know, a group that have been racialized in the USA as inferior races, okay? As opposed to groups that have been racialized in the USA as a superior race. And so this I found, I did comparative study of Caribbean migration in my work. And I saw, for example, in the USA, migration to Miami, New York, for example. And I saw a lot of variations in terms of depending on how the population is perceived, you know. So I divide the migration in three categories. People who are incorporated as white or honorary whites, people who are part of the racial colonial subjects of the US empire. These are people who are here as part of a colonial history, that are not here just because they just came to the USA, but the USA came to them. And this is important in relation to Pacific Islanders, Puerto Ricans, and many groups that have been directly colonized by the USA. And when they migrate to the you know, mainland, let's call it this way, they are in many ways they are perceived. They're part of the racial colonial subject of the empire, of the US empire. You know, also African American, indigenous people, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Pacific Islanders. I mean, these are people who are here for a long time in relation with the USA, because the USA has, in a way, colonized these populations in different ways. Okay, it's not that the colonization is the same. Okay, but we're talking about colonial subjects that have been incorporated to the USA as part of a colonial racial domination. The importance of the colonial racial subjects, you know, for the USA is not so much numbers, it's more the impact in the racial imaginary of the country. For example, in different parts of the USA, there is an experience already with colonial racial subjects of the US empire who've been here for centuries, most of them for more than a century, in the USA as groups that have been colonized and racialized inside the USA. And in the dominant white population, there are some perception of these groups in terms of the racial imaginary of the country. If you go to the Northeast, the experience with Puerto Ricans is very, very, I mean, white populations have already a preconceived notion about Puerto Ricans. If you go to South Florida, for example, you have a white population having a preconceived notion about African Americans, for example, or Latino groups from Puerto Rico or from Cuba for a long time, okay? And then you have in the Southwest, Mexicans, you know, and so on. So these are groups that the moment they arrive to the USA, they're immediately classified in the racial categories, in the cartography of racial categories of the USA, because they've been here for a long time. And there is some kind of idea or stereotype or image about these groups that is already there, you know. So when the white Americans relate to them, they already have a relationship with that group, at least in their imagination. They know more or less who they are and all the racial slanders are already there in place. And of course, the USA, I always say there's no racial formation in the USA. There are many racial colonial formations because there are like USA is so huge that it has like many countries inside one country. What I mean by that is that the regional racial formation of Southwest is not the same one as the Northwest, it's not the same one as the Northeast, it's not the same one as the Southeast, it's not the same one as the central part of the USA, and etc. There's many colonial histories in the USA that are not the same. And this has implications because the racial imaginary is regionally different, depending on who were the colonial racial subjects that the white population were colonizing in different parts of the USA. So for example, you say Puerto Rican, let's say in the Northwest of the USA, it's like people know something, but it's too far away from them. It's as opposed to a place like New York, in the Northeast of the USA, New York, Boston, the Northeast cities of the USA. Maybe with the exception of Milwaukee, okay? That is a place where there is a big Puerto Rican community for a long time. And the same thing you could say of Mexican population and, or other populations that are part of the colonial racial subject empire that are here as part of a long-term colonial history. And then there is a third category that I call colonial migrants, okay? The colonial migrants are people are not directly colonized by the USA, but when they arrive to the USA, they're immediately classified like the colonial racial subjects empire that have been here long time before. For example, I refer to the Puerto Ricanization of Dominicans in New York. When Dominicans start arriving in the mid-60s, from the mid-60s on in big numbers, a lot of New Yorkers saw them as another Puerto Rican. Dominican Republic, that might be a town in Puerto Rico, okay? So there was a lot of racial classification put in place against Puerto Ricans that was extrapolated to the Dominicans. And that's what I call the Puerto Ricanization of Dominicans in New York. So in a way, they were racialized in similar ways than the Puerto Ricans, or the African Americanization of Haitians in South Florida. People from Haiti arriving there and then immediately being classified as another Black group and extrapolating to them all the racial slanders, all the racial domination that is already in place, structures of racial domination in South Florida in relation to African Americans, And if you go to LA, you can find the Mexican Americanization of Salvadorians and Guatemalans, that they arrive and this is another Mexican, and they're mistreated as another Mexican in the Southwest, especially in cities like LA and other cities where they migrate. And so I'm saying this because I kind of split three main experiences that are the migrants who arrive and then immediately classified as whites, and they live white privilege, and they go through the path of the experience of white European incorporation to the USA that you could see from the 18th, 19th century all the way till today. And they live, in a sense, the privilege of whiteness, even though they're migrants, and they get incorporated in a more successful way than other groups. And then you have the racial colonial subjects of empire, who are people who have been here for a long time, and wherever they go, there's already some kind of, in different regions of the USA, some kind of relationship to these groups, and racial imaginary is already focused on these groups because of the long-term relationship they have inside the USA. And then you have what I call the colonial migrants, people who are not directly colonized by the USA, but when they arrive to the USA, they're reclassified similar to the racial colonial subjects empire that were here before they arrived. So, so I use this classification to look at the different experiences. You could have these experiences happening within within one group. You could have one group where some people might have been living the, colonial racial subject of empire. Other part of the population might be living like colonial migrants. Another part of the population might be incorporated as a white immigrant, And so you could see that it could happen in one single group. You could see the three experiences happening. So the reason I'm bringing these categories is to break down the concept of migrant as if it was a homogeneous group or as if it was a similar, breaking away with the idea of the kind of migrant, this idea that came from the cultural pluralist idea of the migrant experience as being, in a sense, the same for everybody, okay? That you begin from the bottom, then the second generation move upward, and then the third generation get successful, etc. I mean, this idea is basically useful to understand European migration. That is the assimilation paradigm and the cultural pluralist paradigm, where they look at migration as a transition towards social upward mobility, is really based on the experience of European migrants to the USA, especially from the 19th century, early 20th century, where you have this experience exactly the way they describe. People arrive at the beginning, they experience difficulties. After a few generations, then second generation get in a better position, then they get, in a sense, the full rights and the full experience of being a white population, and then the third generation experience upward mobility, and now they are part of the American experience in a successful way. But that experience is very different from the experience of coming here as a slave, okay? Or from the experience of being here as part of a colonial subject, because your country or your territory have been colonized by the USA. So these are different modes of incorporation that we need to account for to understand the present. That is, we need to understand how the structures of today are not frozen in time, but they are really the result of a long history that is entangled with multiple oppression. I take race as a central one because it's an organizing principle for class, gender, and other things. What I mean by that is, then the theory I'm presenting could be made more complex if we look at, for example, if we bring in questions of class, for example, where, for example, if you arrive to a place like Dominicans, they arrive to New York, even though their class origin was in the Dominican migration was higher than the Puerto Rican migration, because most of them were urban, middle sectors, middle classes. They were, at the beginning, they were not exactly the poorest people of the Dominican Republic migrating to the USA. And these people, when they arrived, they were immediately living together with Puerto Ricans and classified as Puerto Ricans. And then the niche occupied by Puerto Rico was cheap labor in manufacturing industry. So that's where the Dominicans were reclassified like Puerto Ricans as cheap labor in manufacturing industry in New York. So look at how the racial classification, in a sense, is constitutive of the class niche that a migrant community will experience, And then, of course, if you bring in questions of gender, then the experience of being racialized, of being placed in a certain niche in the labor market out of that racialization, and then bringing the experience of, male, female in that community immediately brings another dimension that then you could see the entanglement of the multiple oppressions working out in a particular historical context for a migrant experience. In the case of Domingo, I mentioned that they were Puerto Ricanized. So they were racialized similar to Puerto Ricans because at the beginning, the host population could not distinguish one from the other. They were just seen as another Puerto Rican in the city, and they will be classified together with Puerto Ricans. And then that racial classification has an impact in the labor market, because the labor market is also stratified in terms of niches that are occupied by certain population, depending on the racial scale. So look at the entanglement here of race and class. We cannot look at race and class as if they were separate categories. They are entangled in many ways. And the same thing with question of gender, because then gender becomes an organizing principle, because then within the division of labor in which a racialized group is classified, then you have another reclassification that has to do with the male and females of that population, okay? Where the gender brings in a further inequality in terms of salary, working conditions, and also what kind of job they occupy in the manufacturing industry, for example, you know? So, as opposed to male. And so all of this then brings a complexity that that is, you know, is fascinating to study, but at the same time, we can see also the human catastrophe in many communities that goes through these experiences from the underside of, you know, of the racial domination. You know, when you look at that experience, then it brings a lot of catastrophic experiences that I think are important to understand. And so one thing that, so this is how methodologically I've been working with these questions, okay? There is, you know, another dimension which has to do with the geopolitics. That is, why is it that people from Martinique in the Caribbean, they migrate fundamentally to Paris? Why, even though Martinique is closer to Miami or New York than Paris, why is it that you hardly see Martinican migration to Miami or to New York? Or why is it that Puerto Ricans migrate fundamentally to the USA and not to Spain? Okay, or why is it that Central American migrants, or you know, they come fundamentally to the USA? And so, I mean, these experiences. I mean, why, for example, at some point in time, is the Salvadorians as opposed to I don't know, Hondurans? Okay, this has to do a lot with the foreign policy of the USA and the U.S. intervention in many countries. Okay. In the case of Martinique, it's obvious. It's a colony of France, and it's obvious that they are being hired by the French state directly in the islands through a state institution that existed for many years called the Bumidom, which was a carbon copy of the migration division in Puerto Rico to recruit people from the island to bring them to work here to the USA as cheap labor. And they model the same, you know, the French state modeled the same migration division in the colonial government of Puerto Rico and they use it, and they replicate this institution in the French context to recruit people from the colonies. And that's how you get a lot of Martinicans, Guadeloupans, people from French Guyana, from the territories of France in the Caribbean, you know, migrating over there, you know, because they were directly recruited as cheap labor to bring them to the metropole. And so, for example, you have to see the different moments in history. Why is it that Cuban migration was fundamentally, at least between 1959 and 1980, fundamentally upper class, middle class people, you know, and as opposed to other migration, you know, Puerto Rican migration that in the same period was fundamentally peasant migration from 1945 until 1980 was a peasant migration. And I mean, all of these have to do a lot of also with the geopolitics. As you know, in the case of Cuba, there was a Cuban Revolution, and then the USA stimulated a mass migration of the skilled labor and professional, etc., to weaken the economy of Cuba as part of a strategy to basically boycott the economy of Cuba and make of Cuba an exemplar of what you should not be doing. And in the middle of the Cold War, right? And and then you have, in the case of Puerto Rico, the attempt at doing a showcase, a developmentalist showcase, okay? And in order to create this developmentalist showcase of U.S. policies in the post-war, that today we call maquiladoras, but at the time, Puerto Rico was the first laboratory of maquiladora, and it has an euphemistic term at the time. It was called industrialization by invitation, okay? And Puerto Rico was the first laboratory of this. And if you look at this, the attempt at creating a showcase of Puerto Rico for this policy that the US wanted to sell all over the third world, they basically stimulated the mass migration of the poorest people of the island. So literally, poor people in Puerto Rico were exported to urban areas of the USA to work in the USA as cheap labor. And they were cleaning the island from poor people because they wanted to showcase the island. So that's why in the class origin of the Puerto Rican migration is a lower class migration, mostly peasants and unskilled labor that were basically export out of the island to the main cities of the Northeast of the USA. But it goes as far as Chicago and Milwaukee, where you have Puerto Rican communities also during that time. And it was the migration division, as I said, that was the organized migration, from the colonial administration, recruiting people directly and bringing them to the mainland. And then using Puerto Rico as a literal showcase by the US State Department in what is known as the 4-point program. I can explain that later if someone is interested. The 4-point program during the Cold War. And so you have more than 40,000 people coming to Puerto Rico, showcasing the island as a model of development that US promoted all over the world. But anyway, this is another dimension we cannot lose sight. Who migrates and at what point in time people migrate massively to the USA? It has a lot to do with the US imperial policies in the region. For example, Dominicans before 1965, they did not migrate anywhere. It was an immigration country. Why it became a migration country after 65? Well, because the US invaded the country militarily, okay, and then put an authoritarian government there. And in order to create political stability for this authoritarian government, they stimulate the mass migration of Dominicans who were in the political opposition, mostly middle class, middle sectors, to go out of the country by under threat of becoming prisoners or killed by this authoritarian regime of Joaquin Balaguer. That was the regime put in power by the US invasion. And Balaguer was run Dominican Republic like for 20, 25 years as president of Dominican Republic. And he was a minister of Trujillo, the old dictator, pro-US dictator. So this guy came to power with the US invasion. And so a lot of the political democratic opposition were basically exiled to New York City. And so, and that's when you have a lot, you look at the statistic, you see a huge hundreds of thousands of Dominicans migrating from 65 to 1970 to the USA and on into the 70s. That's a big wave of migration. A country that never had a migration population. It was always an immigration country. It always brought people from all over the Caribbean to work in Dominican Republic. So all these things you need to also bring into the picture when you are looking at migration, and this of course affects the modes of incorporation to the USA, because for example, if you happen to be a Cuban refugee, you receive the Cuban refugee program organized by the federal government of USA, giving money to the Cuban population to make them a success story in the USA, because they wanted to create a showcase of the Cubans that migrated to the USA, especially in South Florida, as opposed to the ones who stayed behind under communism in Cuba. And they wanted to make them successful in order to ideologically influence the Cubans that were left in the island to see if they rebel against the government, And so they gave them a lot of money. I document that in my book, Colonial Subjects. A lot of billions of dollars were given to the Cuban community to make them a success story in terms of opening businesses, money for business, money for education. For example, the university loans that most of you students are using today, it began with the Cubans in the Cuban refugee program. But of course, the Cubans did not receive the loans with interest rates. That's very different from today. Today, all of you are receiving the loans to study with interest rates. At the time, the Cubans were receiving loans to study without interest rates, okay? And they were receiving also resources to find jobs for them, to job training. A lot of their degrees were convalidated in the USA. So if you were a lawyer, a doctor, engineer in Cuba, you will be immediately recognized here in the USA. And while, for example, Dominicans, that were a lot of engineer doctors, etc., they were never recognized in the USA, their degrees. So it tells you something about geopolitics. Is also very important to understand not only what's the class origin of the migration, not only why in this moment in history, this country sends so many people as opposed to other moment in history, not only in terms of the policies put in place to make them a success story or a failure in the USA, etc. But it brings the whole, the geopolitics bring you a broader picture to understand the patterns, okay, of migration. For example, why Salvadorians came in the 1980s as opposed to 1960s or 70s or after? Well, it's very obvious. There was a civil war in El Salvador, which the USA was siding with this dictatorship against the popular rebellion there. And of course, a lot of people and refugees migrated, and the US was basically, as part of supporting this, this regime, basically opened doors for Salvadorian refugees to come to the USA. So this brought a lot of, a lot of Salvadorians to the USA at the time as part of this civil war and the role of the USA in that civil war. But anyway, so these things we need to account for, they are very important. Now, in terms of now this, broader concepts and discussions, I would like, if there is time, to say something about racism. Usually, we think of racism exclusively as, a group of people who have crazy ideas about, about other people, crazy ideas, stereotypes, etc. And I would say that's important, but that's not only the main issue, okay, of the problem of racism. There is a dimension of racism that I don't have the time to develop more, but racism is always structural. It's always institutional. That is, you have the institutions of the society are complicit or embedded or fostering racism in the society. And this is very important to say, because usually we have the idea that the main problem of racism is people without education, with stereotype and prejudice of other people, and that's the problem, no? And so what we need is more education, and then people will stop being racist. Well, if that was the problem, that would be then the solution to, I'm sorry, the solution to that is to bring to create more education. Then with more education, you're supposed to create to eliminate racism. But the problem is that I'll give you an example. The problem is that, for example, you get the police as an institution, okay? And the police have institutional practices, and those institutional practices they're built upon policy and upon a long-term experience. So many times you have the police go into a community, and in X community, they go and when they intervene, they knock the door, they show their badges with their names, and then they intervene in the situation. In other communities, they come out there and then they bring their weapons out, okay? They hide their badges, and instead of knocking the door, they destroy the door, okay? And so they come violently to those communities. So these are things that are institutional practices. These are not things that are decided by one individual, okay? or it's not an issue that, oh, it's because the police there have prejudice. No, many times you do the prejudice stereotype test to the police, to the policemen, individual policemen intervening in these situations, and many of them pass the test with good grades, you know, in terms of being people that are not, have no stereotype, no prejudice, but as a member of the police force, they follow instructions. So when they go to certain communities, they have to be behaving in a certain way. And this is police institutional practices that are already racist and are racist because there's a long history of this institutional practice being put in place in many areas, regions, cities in the USA. That is, if you go to any city, the way the police behave in X communities is different from the way they behave in Y communities. You know, in a white community, they go with their weapons out and destroying doors. In this other community, they go with their badges out, knocking doors, you know? And so this is very different, okay? This is a very different experience. And that we need to understand in terms of, if we say that the problem is prejudice and stereotype, it's not going to account for the complexity of the problem, because you might get a lot of the police participating in those acts that they have no prejudice and no stereotype about the groups. By the way, there are even Black police and Latino police intervening in those situations. And when you talk to them, they're not exactly prejudicial about their own group. But the police, being a member of the police, they have to follow orders, and the police already institutionally is practicing racism. That is in their institutional practice. That's the distinction I want to make between defining racism as a problem of crazy people with wrong ideas, okay, about other people, as opposed to institutional. Because if you think about racism as a problem of crazy people with bad ideas, then we're talking about a minority of the society. Then it's not a serious problem, racism, because those crazy people, the Ku Klux Klan, or maybe a few like that are extremists, there's not the majority of the society, okay? So it's not exactly a serious problem if you look at it that way, okay? Or you think that the problem in the police is a few bad apples, okay? Because there are individuals that behave this way or that. No. Here is where I'm saying, if you look at the theoreticians and people who have studied racism, the majority of them are, if there's a point where everybody agrees, is that racism is before all institutional racism, structural racism. That's the main problem. And when you have a problem like that, then it's more profound, because now if you say that the institutions, the state institutions, the economic institutions, the business institution, the banking institution, and so on are racist in their institutional practices, then we're dealing with a more profound problem that are not going to be solved that easily, because it will entail a transformation in the structures of power, as opposed to the early definition I mentioned that is about crazy people, small groups in society with crazy people about other, you know, crazy people with crazy ideas about other people. Then the solution there is educate these people and then you get it over. No, the problem is more profound, because it's embedded in the institutions of the society, and is embedded as a result of a long history of white supremacy, colonialism, and so on, and slavery in the USA, for example. Or in other parts of the world, you could see the same problem in relation to that history, that, you know, most of Western European countries has been also involved in that history of slavery, colonialism, racism, you name it, you know. So look at the problems that Europe has today with not only migrants, but people from their own countries that are already citizens, okay, that are Muslims, or there are Blacks, or there are brown people who are now British, French. They're not migrants anymore, okay? They are like 4th generation, 5th generation already. And look at the problems Europe still have today with this. And it has to do because the problem is more profound than just people with stereotypes and prejudice. The problem is institutional, okay? And so what here I would like, the other thing we need to pay attention is that racism could be marked we're living in a society where color racism is the most important form of racism, you know, and racism, the way we think about it is in terms of color racism, and we collapse the definition of race with the marker. Usually when we think about racism, what is racism? We always define it in relation to color racism. Like, okay, it's people that are being inferiorized because of their skin color, okay? And I want to move beyond that definition also because it's a problematic definition. Not because color racism doesn't exist. I just want to say that color racism is a marker of something else happening. Color racism is an effect of something else. The marker we use in the USA is color, but in other parts of the world, European colonialism has used other markers, have used, for example, religious identity as a marker of race, have used ethnic identity as a marker of race. Even within the US experience, you have the color racism, but you have other experiences of racism inside the US history that are not exactly color, are also marked through religious identity or in terms of ethnic identity in the case of the colonization of indigenous people and so on. So, and sometimes you have the overlapping of the two, okay, color and identity. But what I want to say is that there are multiple markers for racism. I'll give you an example, which is very unique, but it's an important example because it illustrates to us many things. If you look at the text of the British until the 1960s about sociobiology, this racist text about, you know, all these things about, you know, measuring the brain of the people, you know, to claim that they are inferior races and, you know, genetic racism and saying these are inferior beings. And then they measure they measure your brain. They come with, you know, IQ levels. This is a population with low IQ levels genetically and so on. So this kind of cultural racism, if you look at the text of the British, you will see there all the people that were colonized by the British. You will see there the Africans, you will see there South Asians, you see Chinese, but you will see also Irish people. Irish people, okay, were classified as an inferior race in the British Empire, okay? And this is very important because it's important to understand, help us to understand what is racism. Because here you have a population where in the colonization of the British they never used color racism. They couldn't use color racism in that context because that marker didn't work there. As a matter of fact, many Irish were whiter than the British, okay? And so they could not use that as a marker. So what did they use? They used religious identity to mark superiority, inferiority, the Protestants and the Catholics. And this religious identity was used as a racial classification, superiority, inferiority, in the context of British colonialism in Ireland. And I'm saying that because just to illustrate how in different colonial histories, you could have different markers. Whenever color racism doesn't work, they will use something else, okay? Wherever you know, religious identity doesn't work, they will use another one. But the point is that the marker, there are many markers there's only one race form, you know, one definition for racism in my view, but there are many markers of racism depending on the colonial history that you're looking at. If you look at North Africa, French colonization, North Africa, there were the Muslims, Christians. That was the classification. And you will see many Muslim, blonde hair, blue eyes in North Africa that were part of the inferior races, you know, and you see that replicated today in France, you know, and so on. So look, the marker there was not color, was more religious identity as the marker, or national identity. You know, when you say Algeria in the context of the French Empire, it has a meaning, okay? And it has a meaning that connotates an inferior race when you talk about that. The same with, look, Puerto Ricans. Puerto Rican are multiple races. There are many races inside Puerto Ricanness. But when you go to New York City and you say Puerto Rican, it doesn't matter. If you are lighter skin, dark skin, it doesn't matter. You're Puerto Rican. And that's a meaning and a connotation in the context of New York City, just to give you an example, no? Of how the complexity of the marker and the definition. The problem we have in many of the debates about racism in the USA is that we collapse the marker with the definition. We reduce the definition to the marker, and we don't understand then what exactly is going on, okay? Look at the Islamophobia in the US today. Islamophobia is a form of racism in Western Europe and USA today that has been very important, you know? But to make a long story short, I define racism as a hierarchy of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human, okay? Superiority, inferiority along the line of the human. And whoever is superior, okay, is considered equal to the human. Whoever is inferior is considered equal to subhuman or non-human. Okay, it's a classification below the line of the human. You're subhuman or non-human. And this line of the human is a classificatory line of the superior and the inferior. And then how do you mark that? Superiority, inferiority along the line of the human. In some places they use color racism. In other places they use religious identity. In other places they use ethnic identity, and so on. You know, there are different markers. The importance is when those markers are classifying people in relation to superiority, inferiority along the line of the human. When that is happening, you have a problem of racism there. And then what happened is that the superior are considered the human and the superior are the subhuman, non-human, but then the superior are considered what Frantz Fanon called the zone of being. And zone of being for Fanon was meant that, you know, it's already very bad that you as a racialized subject can, you know, zone of being, zone of non-being, okay? It's talking there about the problems of racism. It's not just a problem of discrimination in the labor market or a problem of discrimination in your human rights or citizenship rights. He's saying it's pervasive because zone of being is all the activities of social existence that human beings do in society, okay? And he's talking about how the forms of thinking, for example, of the people who are classified superior, their form of thinking, their epistemologies, no, in this case, European tradition, the religious practices, the forms of praying, okay, in this case, Christendom, the forms of aesthetic, what is beauty, what is ugly, what is good taste, what is bad taste, the aesthetics, the forms of aesthetic, forms of praying, forms of thinking, forms of doing things, forms of political authority or economics, is the superior ways of doing things, the human ways of doing things. So that's the parameter to judge humanity based on the zone of being, the superior being, what they do becomes the measurement of humanness. Whoever distant from those things, the more you distant from that, the more you get into the zone of non-being, the more you get into people who are classified closer to the animal world. And in the zone of, below the line of the human, the inferiorized people, subhuman, non-human, live in the zone of non-being, meaning by that all the social practices they do are considered savage, barbarian ways of doing things. Their spiritual practices, their ways of thinking, their epistemologies or philosophies, their aesthetics, what they consider beauty, ugly or good taste, bad taste, all of that is put in question mark as something that is uncivilized, barbarian, savage, inferior. And so the point that Fanon is making with this concept is, and Fanonian philosophers of the Caribbean who have developed further this point, is that not only is already bad that you've been you being dispossessed economically and from your rights, and economically from your resources. But it's on top of that, everything you do is putting question mark, everything, So racism is more pervasive because it just covers all the activities that are included as part of the human activities of a group, and they are all put in question as the wrong way, the inferior way, the savage way, barbarian way of doing things. So, but then inside the zone of being, you have conflicts. It's not that the zone of being is a happy place. It's a place with conflicts. Zone of the people who are considered and classified as superior, there's always an I and another there that has to do with conflict, that are class conflicts, gender conflicts, you have sexual conflicts, even national colonial conflict you could have in that zone, okay? So, but what makes them zone of being is that they live racial privilege. That's what is common to that zone. Even the people who are oppressed in that zone, they live their oppression reduced by racial privilege. So if you're at work and you're exploited, you still get better salary, better working condition, labor rights, and so on, because you happen to be part of the superior race. And therefore you live the exploitation as a worker with racial privilege, mitigated by racial privilege. The same way with gender. You could be oppressed inside the zone of being for patriarchal reasons, but then your oppression, you will live it in a different way and mitigated by racial privilege, having access to resources or codes of law or whatever that allows you to cope with the situation in a way that is going to be different from the experience in the zone of non-being. And so on. The same with sexual oppression or national colonial oppression. Now, in the zone of non-being, people live the same oppressions, but aggravated by racial domination. Look, I use the term mitigated by racial privilege in the zone of being, aggravated by racial domination in the zone of non-being, okay? Underline these two words, because what leads to this difference, by living class domination, aggravated by racial domination, or living gender oppression, sexual oppression, aggravated by racial oppression, and national colonial oppression, aggravated, by racial oppression. I'm talking about the entanglement here of multiple oppressions, okay? And how these multiple oppressions operate differently in zone of being than zone of non-being because of the way racial domination works to give privilege to one group and to affect negatively significantly the groups in the zone of non-being. Now, what is the difference? Why mitigated in one zone because of racial privilege? Why aggravated because of racial domination? It has to do with the materiality of domination. Okay, it has to do with, in the zone of being, because the humanity of the oppressed people are not in question, the oppressor extend codes of law and emancipatory discourses to the people who are oppressed in that zone. That's the materiality of domination passes through process of emancipation and regulation. Regulation meaning codes of law. You have access to human rights, women's rights, labor rights, and so on. So you have access to democratic rights, civil rights, and you don't need to fight for civil rights because they're granted to you. You're part of the superior beings who are considered the human, and therefore the oppressor deals with the conflicts in a more peaceful way, dealing with the conflicts with exceptional moments of violence, okay? And you have codes of law, as well as emancipatory discourse, the recognition of claims for equality. claim for freedom, for liberty, claim for all these claims of emancipatory discourse are recognized by the oppressor over the oppressed in the zone of being. And, and so the conflicts are managed as a trend in peaceful ways with exceptional moments of violence. In the zone of non-being, the materiality of domination of the system is through violence and dispossession. So whenever you have a conflict, the system mobilizes violence and dispossession towards the communities in the zone of non-being. That's why I'm saying that in the zone of being, people live all these oppressions I mentioned mitigated by racial privilege, while in the zone of non-being, people live these oppressions aggravated by racial domination, because it has to do with the materiality of domination. That is, in one zone is regulation emancipation, in the other zone is violence and dispossession, with exceptional moments of peace in the zone of non-being. So here you have two different experiences of being oppressed by class, okay? A working class, you're oppressed zone of being, you oppressed zone of non-being, you're living complete different experiences of capitalist exploitation of labor. If you happen to be a woman in the zone of being, woman in the zone of non-being, you're living complete different experiences of patriarchal domination. And the same with sexual domination, LGTB populations, or the same with national colonial oppressions. Well, look at the Palestinians; they are killed every day. You know, in experience of national colonial oppression, the Palestinians are killed every day. It's not even news anymore. They're killed every day and nobody cares. Okay, or look at indigenous communities in the U.S. or Latin America, where there are or Black communities here, or they're constantly at every day the police kills a Black person in the USA or a Latino person in the USA. The difference is if they were caught in an iPhone or not in the killing of the person, because when they're caught in the iPhone, then you see what really happened, as opposed to the version of the police about what happened, okay? And this is the new thing that has happened, because that's been going on for centuries in this country. Every day they've been killing Black people, Latino people, every day. The difference is that lately with the iPhone, you can get in camera live what really happened and then contrast with what the police said. And then that's created the Black Lives Matter movement, because it was overwhelmingly obvious what was happening, you know? And and then, of course, the irony of the situation is that the majority of the police caught in camera killing a Black person on the back, or, you know, arbitrarily a Latino, or they come out of the trials innocent. They come out clean from the trial with a few exceptions. It's just amazing how the criminal justice system is already poisoned by racism to the point that you have in camera abuses of, you know, arbitrary killing of people, of kids, of you name it, you know, Latino kids, Jews, whatever, Black kids, killed by the police arbitrarily, and then the police come out clean. I mean, it's just amazing how this happened. And that's when you have the Black Lives Matter movement emerging in the USA. It got to a point where it was, you know, it's just overwhelming. But this is not new. These are the Black community, Latino community know what is happening for a long time in this country. But it was always the version of the community vis-a-vis the version of the police. And you know what happened in a court of law, who is going to have the upper hand? And this what happened. That's why they always acquitted. But now with the iPhones, you're getting all these things in camera, and now that's why the movement became so strong, because now a lot of people, even white people, are seeing the abuses. You know, are seeing what the Blacks and Latinos have been saying for a long time, how bad the situation is, and so to finish, there is a definition that I use to talk about what is racism. For me, racism is a structural domination of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human, where the people classified as superior, hyperhumanized, people classified as inferior, dehumanized. And based on that classification, you have a differential materiality of domination where people in the superior side experience methods of regulation emancipation to for the system to deal with conflicts, while in the other zone of being, or the zone of the inferiorized people, the methods of the system are violence and dispossession. So that creates produce life in one zone and produce premature death in the other zone. Okay, so for me, racism is not prejudice of a people, it's life or death. It's the production of a system that produces premature death in one population and life in the other population. You know, and premature death could arrive to you by a bullet in your head from the police, or could arrive to you because of environmental racism, you happen to be living in a zone of the city where all the polluted things go to your community, or to the water in your community is already polluted, or it could arrive to you through lack of resources for healthcare because you happen to be in this dispossessed community, or it can arrive to you through bad nutrition, or it could, you know, there are ways through which this can arrive to you, the premature death. And this is a production of a racial domination, okay, that you see constantly being put in place, producing life in one zone and producing premature death in the other. Now, this is very important because now the problem of racism is more profound than just a problem of people with prejudice of stereotypes. You know, it's not about crazy people with prejudice of stereotypes. It's about structures of domination and a different structure of the materiality of domination applied to one community as opposed to the other, by the hyperhumanization of one people and the dehumanization of other people. And in racism, you always have the two sides of the same coin. If you have people are dispossessed, their people are getting privileged. So these two things go together. And we usually talk about the disadvantage of racism, the people who are the victim. We never talk about the privilege of the people who live racial privilege and how much resources and quality of life they get out of the deal, okay, of being in a superior hyper-humanized zone of the system, the zone of being. Anyway, this has a lot to do with international migration because, of course, a lot of the migrants, as I said, many of the migrants are classified as colonial migrants as part of the racial colonial subjects of the empire and are classified in that zone, leaving the materiality of domination, violence, and dispossession that you see with the racial ethnic subjects, racial colonial subjects of the empire, as opposed to people who are classified as part of the white population that live a complete different experience of migration than the others. But anyway, this is a concept that I think is very important to discuss and to clarify, because we use the term, many people use the term, but meaning so many different things that the term has loose content or analytic rigorosity, because we are saying, you know, using the term racism, and we think we know what we're talking about, but no, we're not talking about the same thing, because there are so many different definitions of racism, especially in mainstream USA, liberal societies, the definition is always about individuals with crazy idea about other groups, prejudice or stereotype. And in doing that, what they're doing is trivializing the problem. Trivializing because the problem is more profound. It's about life or death. It's about premature death, systematic premature death towards populations that are the target of racial domination. I stop here.
Thank you, Ramon. Thank you, Ramon, for the complexity of this talk, for combating the active ignorance and erasure, historical erasure of the diversity of migrant lives. We have a lot of questions already in the Q&A and only 15 minutes to go through them. So I am going to, if you don't mind, Ramon, couple two questions at a time to see
yes,
how many we can cover. I don't know if you can see the questions in the Q&A feature there. We have a question by Megan Wilburn, who I believe is an undergraduate, brilliant undergraduate student with us here. She asked the discussion, and I'm going to couple this with another question, the discussion of low-income people being exported forced labor for the United States makes me wonder, to what extent is this migration forced, and how much of migration would you say this type of migration accounts for? And in a similar spirit, we have a professor from the University of Puerto Rico, Michael Kusher, that is asking, can you say something about how the forced migrations at the center of this talk and the structures of racialized dispossession behind them are shaping the struggle for public education in contemporary Puerto Rico, where university students are currently on a strike, protesting the looting of the public services under the debt adjustment plan imposed by the colonial government in the Washington, D.C.? Do these migratory frameworks help to explain the lack of public support for the striking students in Puerto Rico? So his questions have various layers, but both connect with this. What explains these forced migrations?
Forced migration from where to where? That's the first question I would like to know about the question.
Well, in the second one is directly talking, it's coming from the UPR, right? Directly talking about Puerto Rico. And the first one was asking it more in general terms, right?
Yes. Well, in the Puerto Rican experience, as I mentioned, we're talking about, I mean, for example, African American, you know, the slave, the importation of slave to the Americas, that's not migration, okay? I want, that's not a migration. That is African American right to the USA, not as part of a migration, but as part of kidnapping human beings, you know, and bringing them by force to be enslaved here, you know? That's not migration, that's forced migration, okay? But then you have another type of migration, which is that you move out because you have no other choice, okay? Because basically the situation in your country is so devastating because there is a war. Like in the case of Libya, Syria, all these countries today that were destroyed by US machine and NATO machine. And now you have all these people leaving the country because they have no other choice, not because they wanted to leave, but there's nothing, you know, the country is devastated, you know, or Afghanistan migrants, also refugees, and so on, you know. So you go there, destroy the country, and then you have people running away from the place because you risk being killed there, or the devastation is so huge that you cannot live there a decent life, you know. So you have all these, you know, refugee migrants running and crossing borders, okay? Or you have situations like in Puerto Rico, where the devastation of the economy and the dispossession of the population is so huge that many people opt to leave the island. And where do they go? Because they have the US passport, then they come to the USA looking for a job or looking for other alternatives. That's another one. Look at the growth in Puerto Rican migration the last 10 years, you know, in the 2010s. It compares with the numbers of the 1950s of last century, okay? The numbers are huge. It's close to, you know, they get close to above 500,000 people, close to 1 million people leaving the island, you know? And so the numbers are huge, and they're leaving silently because they don't constitute a refugee migration because they are US citizens. So they take an airplane and leave the island and go to live elsewhere in the USA. So this is another form of forced migration, but there are gradations, you know, gradations of forced migration, because it's not exactly slavery, but it's a situation where the choices are so limited that you have many youths in Puerto Rico looking to get out of the island, you know, looking to find other alternatives. There's no future there, you know? And so because of US colonialism there, and because of the disasters that US have created there, but then they try to make Puerto Ricans responsible, you see, of what's happening in Puerto Rico. So if the colonial administration is a huge debt, US empire don't take responsibility. They just put there a Wall Street syndicate, you know, called La Junta, you know, the Promesa, no? It's a board there that they put there of Wall Street, named by Obama. If you remember, the Obama administration will continue during the Trump administration, Biden, etc., that they're the ones deciding the budget of the island. That is, you first pay the Wall Street, and once you pay Wall Street, whatever is left, then you put it in education, health, or whatever. So, you know how many schools have been closed in Puerto Rico in the last 10 years? It's over 500, 600 schools, hospitals, hundreds of hospitals closed down. And you name it, the basic needs of the people doesn't matter. What matters is paying to Wall Street. So all the tax, you know, collected by the colonial administration, they go to Wall Street. They don't go to, and the great majority of that debt is usury debt. It's debt that has been, like, for example, of 36, the latest figure I heard is $36 billion, of which 4 or 5 billion were real debts of the loans taken by the Puerto Rico, and the rest is interest rates. You know, the other 32 billion is based on interest, growing interest, which is usury capital. And, you know, usury capital is just amazing. And so they're plundering the island. And now, what does it have to do with racism? It has everything to do with racism, because they will never do that to any state of the United States, okay? Any state of the United States have the right to declare bankruptcy and clean up the debts, okay? Any city in the United States have the right to clean up the debts, okay? Declare bankruptcy. Puerto Rico have no right to declare bankruptcy. As a colony of USA, have zero right to do that. So they're forced to pay the debt in the terms of the Wall Street investors. You cannot negotiate that. You see what I mean? It's like it's a very, very difficult situation, and that has a lot to do with racism, because, of course, this is a population that is considered an inferior race, and they super exploit Puerto Rico. They dispossess Puerto Rico from resources, and they've been doing that since they arrived in 1898. You know, so, and this is part of the problem with many of the left and the Marxists, Eurocentric Marxists, I would say, as opposed to Black Marxists or other types of Marxists, African Marxists, or Latin American Marxists like Mariátegui, is that they forget the question of race. That is, they think of the international division of labor in capitalism as a class system, and they don't see that the international division of labor is overlapping with a racial, ethnic, global hierarchy. That is, if you're in the periphery and you're a cheap labor in the periphery, it usually overlaps, 95, 99% overlaps with people who happen to be non-Western people, non-white people in the racial classification of the system we live. And these are the cheap labor of the system, you know, and it's not an accident that 95% of the labor in maquiladoras in the planet today, 95% are women of color. 95% of labor in maquiladoras in the world, okay, Latin America, Asia, Africa, you name it, are women of color, okay? It's not an accident that that's the case, because there's an overlapping between race, class, and gender that you cannot lose sight. And that overlapping is an entanglement. If you notice, I never use the word intersectional. I use the word entanglement, because intersectional is a term used by Gramsci in an intervention she did in the court system, okay, to try to prove discrimination in the court system. So she's coming from critical race theory, and she developed a way to apply the concept of the Black feminist in the context of a liberal court, like in the USA. where you cannot entangle discrimination. You know, you go to a court, you need to prove discrimination by disentangling them, and then looking at how they intersect later at a point, right? So you prove gender discrimination separate from racial discrimination, separate from class discrimination, and then later you can intersect them, right? That's not the reality of the social world. I'm a sociologist. That's not the reality. The reality is that in the social world, these oppressions do not happen as gender here, race there, and class over there. No, they happen entangled in a body, in a group of people. And so, I prefer to use the old Black feminist concept of interlocking of oppressions or multiple oppressions used by Angela Davis, by Barbara Smith, by all these Black feminists who were talking about this entanglement of oppression, but never intersection of oppression, because that's not how it happened historically in reality. You know, lately, someone like Angela Davis used the term as part of a term that had become common among Black feminists. But when you examine her take on the concept, it's a very different conception from what you hear in Crenshaw, because and Crenshaw didn't try to do a universal theory. She was in fact applying the insights of the Black feminists to a court system, to the tribunals of the USA and the criminal justice system. She was trying to do that, and that's a great thing she did. It's a very interesting critical race theory in law, in schools of law and so on, but it doesn't work as a theory for the social world. I prefer to use, for example, the matrix of domination used by Patricia Hill Collins in the 80s, the matrix of domination and so on. I mean, concepts like this that are more useful when you think in terms of the social, historical, concrete experience of the multiplicity of oppressions entangled in a historical moment.
Ramon, we only have a couple of minutes, so I'm gonna entangle two questions using that word that comes from physics, right? One by two graduate students, one about the question of humanity and one about the question of neoliberalism, which are two concepts very much tied. Eli, who is a sociology graduate student, asks, how can we even begin to eliminate institutional racism whenever it is bolstered and reproduced by neoliberal ideology? It seems to me that without eliminating racism and capitalism simultaneously, then neither can be solved. What can we do? It's very much connected to what you were saying now. And also Cass Diaz, who is a graduate student, I believe, in the English department, asked us, regarding the way racism and other forms of domination are produced as a relationship to humanness, much scholarship has called for a critique or even destruction of the concept of human, because it is used to justify so much death. Can you speak more to your view of the concept of human and your relationship, antagonistic or otherwise, you maintain with the concept? And with your answers here, we will close out a wonderful day of conversations.
Yeah, wow, these two questions are amazing, and you cannot answer in 2 words, I mean, it's a long, answer to this one. They're great questions. Let me say that I won't throw away the concept of the human. I won't throw it away. I will decolonize the concept of the human, you see, from the definitions that have come up from the West, that usually the human is a particular, the human is not all human beings. It's a particular group of people who are classified as the West over the rest, and the rest are inferior beings. So this kind of humanism is very problematic. It's racist. It's part of the system of racial capitalism. To answer to the first question, it's racial capitalism. Capitalism has always been entangled with racial domination, patriarchal domination, and so on. So I don't have the time to develop that now here, but just to say that human, I will redefine the human. I will come up back to the project of Fanon and Césaire, who were talking about founding a new humanism, founding a different a different anthropology of the human that has to be different from the anthropology of the human of the West in racial capitalism, and let me say this to finish. If you are anti-patriarchal, that is feminist, or you are anti-homophobia, etc., that is that you are in a queer movement for gay, lesbian liberation, whatever. If you are decolonial, okay, if you are anti-racist, if you are anti-capitalist, if you're not anti-imperialist, you're going to be co-opted by the system. That is the first thing. Not every anti-imperialist is decolonial, but every decolonial has to be first and before everything anti-imperialist, okay? And I would say the same for feminists, for everything. If you don't have there a clear picture of the cartography of power of the world we live and a radical anti-imperialist position, you're going to be co-opted by the system, and your struggle is going to turn into some kind of identity struggle that is going to always be co-opted by the system through multicultural liberalism. And I will say that if you really want to move forward into a struggle that is going to take seriously the oppressions, injustices in its multiplicity in the world we live, you need to tackle the imperialist, global imperialist system. You need to be radically anti-imperialist, because that global imperialist system is the one that have the entanglement of these multiple oppressions, okay, put in place all over the world. And you cannot be feminist without being anti-imperialist. You cannot be anti-racist without being anti-imperialist. You cannot be anti-capitalist without being anti-imperialist. You cannot be anti-colonial without being anti-imperialist. You have to take the anti-imperialism seriously, because that's the foundation of the system we're living that produce all these multiple oppressions. And if you want to really fight back and succeed, we need to create a united front of anti-imperialist movements, taking seriously the transformation of this civilization into a new civilization that will go beyond these forms of domination, exploitation, and oppressions.
Thank you so much, Ramon, as behalf of the entire Humanities on the Edge team and all the people who came. Thank you very much. The graduate students that did the work. Thank you very much. I think that's a good note to end. I couldn't agree more. There's no anti-racism without anti-imperialism in the process. So thanks everybody who come, and we said that we were going to finish at 7, so we were going to stop there, and that's it. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you, Luis, for the